I hope that Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder don't end up being like Lennox Lewis versus Riddick Bowe, a rivalry that goes nowhere. Now, obviously, there are a lot of differences between Joshua Wilder versus Lewis and Bowe, but I'm gonna focus on the similarities between the two situations. Riddick Bowe and Lennox Lewis were rivals from the amateur days, when they fought at the '88 Olympics in Seoul, Korea specifically. Lennox Lewis stopped Riddick Bowe in the second round, and there was a lot of bitterness from Riddick Bowe about the fact that Lewis beat him. He believed the stoppage was premature, etc. When they turned professional, they seemed to be on a collision course. There was still a lot of skepticism among the American media about Riddick Bowe because of the nature of his defeat to Lewis in the Olympics, and because there'd been rumors from the gyms and whatnot that Riddick Bowe wasn't a particularly diligent trainer. There was rumors of him getting beaten up in sparring by people like Tyrell Biggs, etc, etc. And then as he ascended his way up the ranks and ended up beating the likes of Tyrell Biggs, he was shaken in the Biggs fight when they fought as pros. He had a very close decision over Tony Tubbs. A lot of people were dubious about whether he actually won that fight, but eventually he proved himself against Evander Holyfield, and that night when he beat Evander Holyfield, he really won over the American press, and they started believing in him. And Riddick Bowe had a manager, a very colourful, flamboyant manager called Rock Newman, who was a very outspoken type of character, and he was constantly beating the drum and selling Riddick Bowe as the best thing since sliced bread, selling Riddick Bowe as the second coming of Muhammad Ali and all sorts. So by this point, Riddick Bowe was the spiritual replacement, the spiritual successor to Mike Tyson, because Mike Tyson was in prison by the time Riddick Bowe won his heavyweight title against Evander Holyfield, in a fantastic fight, by the way, one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. So yeah, Riddick Bowe was seen as the number one heavyweight in the world, certainly the number one American heavyweight. But then along came Lennox Lewis, who actually, Lewis knocked out Razor Ruddock, which was a final eliminator for the WBC heavyweight title, before Bowe fought Holyfield. So Lewis knocked out Ruddock, he became mandatory, then Bowe fought Holyfield. Bowe won. Bowe had the WBC strap as well as the IBF and WBA. So these two were supposed to fight, Lewis and Bowe. But in an unprecedented, well, I don't want to say unprecedented, but in a shocking move, Riddick Bowe actually refused to face Lennox Lewis, and he deposited the WBC World Heavyweight title in the bin, in a trash can, on television. This went around the world. It was all over the news. Riddick Bowe putting his WBC belt in the bin, refusing to face his mandatory challenger Lennox Lewis. It was the most shameless and blatant duck I've ever seen in all my life in boxing. However, such is the denial and madness that goes on in the brains of many boxing fans. Riddick Bowe convinced his army of fans that it was actually Lennox Lewis who was ducking him. I mean, just an incredible turn of events. Imagine throwing your belt in the bin on television to avoid fighting your mandatory Lennox Lewis, and then you're running around saying that Lewis is the one ducking you. Similar kind of situation to what we have now with Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua, where it's clear that it's Team Wilder who are avoiding the fight at the moment, delaying the fight happening. They're clearly the ones who are not keen on the fight happening next. But yet you've got this army of fans, just like you did with Riddick Bowe, who are convinced that actually it's Anthony Joshua who's ducking, even though it's him and his team who are making all the serious moves to try and get the fight made, who are arranging meetings, who are, you know, etc, etc. So there's parallels there between the two situations. And with Riddick Bowe, by the way, this whole ridiculous notion that Lewis was ducking him carried on all the way through their careers. To be fair, there was eventually a time when Riddick Bowe was willing to fight Lennox Lewis. Their fight nearly got made a couple of times, but both guys kept losing. See, this was the problem. There was talk of Lennox Lewis fighting Riddick Bowe prior to Lewis losing to Oliver McCall, because Lewis was supposed to fight McCall, beat McCall, then he was going to fight no, sorry, he fought Bruno, beat Bruno, then he was supposed to fight Tommy Morrison, but Morrison lost. Then he went and fought Oliver McCall, and they were about to fight Riddick Bowe, hopefully beat McCall, then fight Bowe. The fight didn't happen. So there were moments, there were times when Bowe was willing to fight Lennox Lewis later on in Lewis's career, but the both of them were suffering losses which prevented the fight from happening. But initially, when they first rose to prominence, when Lewis beat Ruddock, at that time, Riddick Bowe blatantly ducked Lennox Lewis, and it was confirmed years and years after both guys retired by Eddie Futch, who was the trainer of Riddick Bowe. Eddie Futch said that he was actually the guy who stopped the fight from happening. He said that when Lewis beat Ruddock and Bowe beat Holyfield, at that time he said that Bowe was not mentally mature enough to fight Lennox Lewis, and that he wanted to build him up mentally before taking the Lewis fight. So Eddie Futch was the guy who stepped in and said, "Nah, my fighter's not taking that fight right now." Proof, an absolute concrete confirmation, if we needed any anyway, that Riddick Bowe, or at least his team, were the ones ducking the Lewis fight back in 93, must have been around 92, 93 is when they were ducking the Lewis fight. Again, they were willing to take it a few years down the line, but initially they were the ones ducking it. And Lewis and Riddick Bowe never ended up settling their beef in a professional boxing ring, sadly, because the timing just didn't line up. Both guys suffered losses, and by the time they were ready to fight, their careers were going in different directions. I hope a similar situation don't manifest itself with Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, because one of these guys or both of these guys could suffer losses and they could end up going in different directions, and the timing just may not line up. You have to remember, at championship level, even at top 10 contender level, most fighters are not going to fight more than 2-3 times a year, and on top of that you get injuries coming in and all this kind of stuff. So it can actually be quite difficult to fight everybody out there, because you're only going to have so many dates during a year. So again, I hope that Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder doesn't end up like Lewis and Bowe, and the more fights Team Wilder try and put in between now and facing Anthony Joshua, the more chance there is that either one of them could lose. Yeah. I, as a selfish boxing fan, wish Deontay Wilder's team would strike while the iron is hot, stop avoiding the fight at the moment, and just go ahead and have it next. Forget Dominic Brazil, forget about all that. Let's just sit down with Eddie Hearn, have a meeting with him like a sensible adult. Yeah, allow Eddie Hearn to actually sit face to face with you, just the way boxing deals are actually made. Hash out a deal, get some draft contracts going, and see if we can make the fight. As a selfish boxing fan, that's what I want. But Team Wilder seem to have other ideas. So yeah, those are the parallels I see between the potential parallels I see between the rivalry between Joshua and Wilder and Lewis and Bowe. Lewis obviously being the Joshua character and Bowe being the Wilder character. Stylistically, they're not the same at all as fighters, any of them. But in terms of their position in the heavyweight division, it's a similar kind of situation. Although, at the time when Lewis and Bowe were rivals, Bowe had more belts than Lewis, whereas in this situation with Joshua, Joshua's got more belts than Wilder. But Bowe, like Wilder, was the American who was highly touted by his own people, and he was ducking Lennox Lewis, avoiding the Lennox Lewis fight, or his team were, just as Wilder at the moment is, or his team are avoiding the Anthony Joshua fight, but yet ridiculously claiming, despite all the evidence to the contrary, ridiculously claiming that it's Joshua who's avoiding it, just as Bowe ridiculously claimed that it was Lewis who was avoiding the fight. And again, years later, the truth comes out. Eddie Futch was the one blocking it. He didn't want Riddick Bowe to go in there with Lewis because he felt like Bowe wasn't ready for Lewis mentally. He wasn't mature enough. So, yeah, anyway, let me know how you feel in the comment section below. Will this situation turn out to be like Lennox Lewis, Riddick Bowe, where they never end up fighting as pros? Because one or both of them suffer losses? Hopefully not, we'll see. It's happening, I'm out.